Hello and welcome to Tea Time. I am T, and in this podcast, this episode, I'm going to discuss the international system for its many parts. The reading room is now open. And first of all, we need to recognize that international law isn't really exercisable in any country. That, like a good romantic relationship or familiar relationship, countries have to allow each other to be sovereign, meaning that country A can't interfere with country B, and country B can't interfere with country A, and so on. They have to respect each other's territory. And of course, this is more that other kind of theory than it is practice. We can see plenty of examples, and I'll show plenty of examples in this talk that violate the principles of the international system as expressed in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. However, simply because countries don't abide by rules, or because there are persistent violators and there are recalcitrant, non-compliant actors, doesn't mean that they didn't agree to the terms. And best as anybody can figure, the only way we're going to have any sort of order at scale is if each country undertakes to independently and voluntarily cooperate and then, sure, pursue its own interests, but also respect that other countries have their own interests too. And the only way we can have a civilized and peaceful or functional system is if there is a balance and each country feels connected to the international system, which it goes about its business intending to support in some way. But of course that's not the case. Just like individuals violate their own conscience and do things that are against their own better interests, and certainly individuals do things that disrupt the flow and the peace and civility of the group. Individuals lie, cheat, steal, commit acts of violence to varying degrees, just as countries do. A country and a group, moreover, is just a collection of individuals. And perhaps, certainly there's more pseudo-anonymity at the group level. Like when a country goes to war with another country, there are so many people involved that it's impossible to prosecute all of the malefactors. And in fact, there's generally just the one or few leaders who get prosecuted, if at all. But these are indeed people doing this thing. And so when assessing the likelihood of whether peace is possible or whether even good things and functionality and anything short of delusion and distortion is possible, people seem to regress and rely on ancient, sort of jaded and cynical axioms like that it's human nature to do bad things, whereas those same people might recognize that there's free will in every action, absent actual observable coercion. So the idea that it's human nature that we're always going to have wars and that's the way it's always been, so that's the way it's always going to be, is it's either intentionally excluding the possibility because it's unlikely, or it's mistaking a low likelihood with impossibility, which is a mathematical error. And I think a lot of our problems in here are just simple failures to know and understand math and science, which would demonstrate through, whether it's rolling a dice or predicting behavior of a stock market or trying to predict the behavior of a paramilitary group or something, or another individual across the way. A likelihood, the probability and a possibility are distinct. Just because something is improbable doesn't mean it's impossible. Just because something's possible doesn't make it probable. And people make this mistake all the time in a lot of different ways, that because maybe humans are just so generally focused on dichotomies, and people love simple, obviously, but that's not terribly helpful, because the world is in a simple place. The impossible thing is the device that I'm speaking on. Impossible is that we would have life on this planet. That's virtually impossible. The likelihood of these things coming together randomly is near zero. And the likelihood of humans looking at 10,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago coming up with technologies that we use today and take for granted is near zero. But it certainly, sure enough, we're also living in a world where we can talk to anybody around the world at any time, and show video and send files and do all these different things with communications. And so, again, possibility and probability are important to understand. And so it's possible that we could have, world peace or whatever, and it would probably be a long process then of little by little individuals and states and the representatives coming to understand their role in the international system, and that their feelings and actions have strayed and maybe are intending to stray from the actual intent of, or the aims and purposes, the objectives of the international system, which is pacific settlement of disputes, respect for territorial integrity of sovereign nations, non-use and non-threat of force, non-intervention, this type of thing. And similarly, if individuals want freedoms, then they have to respect that person A has the right to say and think whatever person A wants, and then, there might be disagreements, but that they never turn into violence. But in fact, when we're talking about violence at individual level or at scale, these are just failures to come up with a remedy with words, and that's really the elusive part, that each person, or whether a state actor or an individual or representative of a state or a non-state actor, some sort of militia group, they have demands and wants that they might not be able to articulate, and then often one group or another, or one person or another, has excessively rigid thinking, and they aren't willing to either negotiate and bend and have some sort of joint and several liability for conflict, or some sort of mutually agreeable conclusion, or they are unwilling to participate in the dispute resolution process, or they aren't even able to articulate what they really want, and there's some diluted thinking in a lot of these groups. If you ask me, anybody who goes out and raises arms and thinks that war is going to solve the problems is delusional, because it never does solve the problem. But anyway, let's look at this slide. International law only has as much power as states give it. Just like whatever religion people believe in, or whatever social philosophy they have, it only has as much power as those individuals give it, and only has as much power at scale as there are people who believe in the exact same thing and go about their business doing the exact same thing. So just as two individuals who are having a disagreement, whether it's a married couple or strangers or business associates or whatever, can't really litigate their complaints, so too do countries have difficulty in finding a forum. There's no world court, there's no world government, there's no world police. And part of that is because there's territorial integrity. If there were world police, then they would violate the sovereignty of another country. And oddly, a handful of powerful countries have been able to violate the territorial integrity of other countries, but by arguing that they're the best option, or arguing that it's inevitable, basically. You know, using axiomatic and biased reasoning and talking about ifs as if they are absolutes, you know, mistaking probabilities for inevitability. So, for example, Iraq War, you know, that's a good example. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The United States military had no jurisdiction within Iraq. Iraq did not consent to the overthrow of its government. That's silly. The country is not going to consent to a foreign country coming and occupying and destroying its people and its government and its way of life. That's silly. And then even the evidentiary standards are obviously loose. There was no authorization at the United Nations for use of force in 2001 or 2 whenever the U.S. invaded Iraq. So it wasn't even legal by international law standards. So, and that's the slippery slope that countries and people play when they use violence as a tool for something that could be handled through words if there hadn't been such a mistrust and lack of trust and a loss of trust through generations and years and even centuries and millennia of warring tribes, you know. And if there weren't bad faith on both sides pursuing their own zero-sum games and political interests, you know. So we've got an honor system which gets dishonored. You know, just like individuals lie and cheat and steal and do bad things, so too do states. And states are collections of people. A state without the people is just inanimate objects. It's trees and rocks and birds and things which aren't trying to do anything. You know, they're just living as animals. But we've got a few basic guidelines. I mean, luckily, World War II was so serious and so egregious that afterwards countries had an aim, you know, they had some sort of revelation of sorts, an epiphany that, well, I guess we had better at least try to stop that, and let's write down some words, and we're going to at least go through the motions. Since they had communications technology, they didn't have to rely on boats to carry their mail. You know, there's more interconnections, there's more nodes of connectivity between countries through economies than there are politically, but economy is not the only thing going on, and unfortunately we've got weapons as part of the economy, and so there are all these weapons floating around, and there are all these disenfranchised groups, and you know, there's got to be some way to communicate about, well, this is mine and that's yours, and this is how we're going to deal with our disagreements of sorts. And so the first step is to decide where the country starts and stops, and unfortunately they can hardly agree on that. And sure enough, there are reasons. There are always reasons, but that doesn't change the fact. You know what? There was fraud and, you know, ill tempers and various coercive and dishonest types of maneuvering that went into drawing a lot of the boundaries, perhaps all of the boundaries in all of the world. But at some stage, we've got to just live with what's going on presently and focus on what is rather than what was and what could have been or what could be or whatever that is. So where does the country start and stop? Well, I mean, there are boundaries, and unfortunately, this isn't a historical thing that people can rely on culture and tradition for, because only just recently have there been passports and hard boundaries. And I mean, not too many generations ago, it was go across that river and it's another tribe, and across that mountain range or around the other side of that valley or whatever, there's another tribe, and just don't go over there, or that's their territory. But now there's more population density and more transient population, so people are moving around more than ever, and there's just more people than ever, and so the tribal lines are not exactly an effective way of dealing with where mine starts and yours stops and so whatever. And the same goes for individuals, that, you know, they hardly agree on who said what, when, why, and where, and who's at fault, or who, you know, what, if a married couple gets divorced, well, how do they decide who gets the flower pot and who gets the, you know, the gold or whatever, you know, whatever it is, they can hardly understand what belongs to whom. And the same kind of goes for countries, but there are these general rules, like the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, got these different zones, and that works about as long as there isn't an island from one country near some other country where they're going to disagree about where the exclusive economic zone starts and stops. That works about as long as there isn't oil or some other natural resource or some sort of purported national defense interest within the territorial waters or the exclusive economic zone of another country. And so sovereignty is absolute in some regard, but obviously there are plenty of examples that we'll look at in a moment that contradict that sovereignty is even defined as such. That it's arguable, I suppose, when a country invades another one or occupies another one, or has a border dispute in which they lob grenades or mortar or something across the border, or tries to annex some island group or some shoals or something like that. There's obviously a lot of evidence suggesting that at very best, the borders have not all exactly been settled. And then, so here's the exclusive economic zones, a map. And that's great for the water, and there's a lot of water, but some countries are inland, and most of the border disputes are over land, and so the Convention on Law Sea doesn't exactly help that. And then if you got an archipelago, where one starts and another stops, there's going to be disagreement because apparently people are selfish and self-interested, and their representatives are expected to just smash and grab and get as much as they can, grab it all. And unfortunately, the drawing of borders didn't happen 1,000 years ago, and the borders have been moved I don't know how many times as countries and people decided to go and smash and grab more and more. But so these are all border disputes, and they're happening on land and at sea, but you can see most of them are over land, and a big part of that is because there just weren't countries before, and people don't adapt and change very willingly or very quickly. And when the colonies pulled out, when the European colonies pulled out, they left a vacuum of power and different tribal groups. The old British India was Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, all the, Sri Lanka, all of those places were India, and then no longer is Britain in control there, thankfully, but that left, the new issue of where to draw these hard boundaries. Back in olden times, I suppose it may not have mattered all that much because people generally stayed at home, and they were born into a town and they stayed in that town, or they were born into a farm and they stayed in that farm, and only a few would go out. And language would be a main marker of where one group of people started and another stopped, but natural resources weren't so coveted. And then land was, land's in high supply, and it still is, a lot of unoccupied territories, a lot of forest out there that drives up the price of land because it's monopolized by a few groups. But so all around in Africa too, there, because of the way that, well, it looks like maybe in Ethiopia, the Italians were repelled, but it was sort of a pseudo-colony. And then in around the Belgian Congo there, and over to the Islamic empires. And so whenever the colonies pulled out, they left a vacuum. And then into what do they call it? It's not really the New World anymore, but these are all relatively new things. And because people just don't bend at reality so much as for other people, then there's all these arguments, and they turn into fights because people can't solve their disputes amicably. They refuse to engage with words because each side just wants the whole thing, and all they know is that the other side is wrong. And if two people are pointing at each other, well, even a third person can't say so well that one is right or wrong, and even if the third person says that, then each person is still going to say that that's incorrect. So there is a bit of that human nature, but there are plenty of other examples to suggest that this is not the only way people work. So the default that it's human nature is a little bit closed-minded. Again, it relies on sweeping generalizations and Like just because almost 100% of people do blank doesn't mean that 100% of people do blank, you know. And so there are decimals past the 10th place, you know, and they are maybe not relevant so much with one person because one person is a whole number, but when you're dealing with millions and billions of people, that's a lot of decimals. And so different people do different stuff, but yeah, in general, people don't like to think they're wrong, I suppose. But why is that? I mean, there are reasons why, and then there are plenty of people who change. Not everybody changes, but plenty of people do. So whether individuals or countries, there are ways to resolve disputes, and with individuals it's a little different because the government is always above the individual, and the government has coercive powers even over a corporation. Now, they don't always use their coercive powers to like fine and take the corporation's money for doing bad stuff, and you know, there are a lot of reasons for that, but when it comes to states, there's no enforcement mechanism. So states can voluntarily engage in conciliations, mediation, negotiations, all the way up to arbitration or litigation, but there's not much that can be done if they don't want to comply. You know, there's the ICJ and the ICC, which are the basically civil and criminal courts for governments. Individuals can't apply to those places for relief. And so if an individual has a claim against a country, well, good luck. They have to sue in their own domestic courts. And that's not going to work. The country is not going to decide against itself very often. But countries can sue each other. But again, that only works if they both decide to engage in the process. At the ICJ, compulsory jurisdiction is fairly uncommon, and ICC compulsory jurisdiction or ICC ratification is not very common. And so if one country does a bad thing, then they're not likely to say, oh yeah, let's go to court. I agree. Because it's like suing themselves. That's basically the same as if they, you know, why be dishonest to turn around and then be honest about it? I suppose that's kind of how it works. And so without mutual consent, the dispute's unlikely to be resolved, and you know, then I guess we just hope that it doesn't go to war or whatever. There are a lot of consequences for failure to settle disputes. Violence is the highest or the most consequential outcome. It's not a guarantee, but there's economic problem. You know, there's just a lower quality of life. If people hate each other, it's not exactly a happy way of life. And then anymore, you know, they're losing the benefit of communicating and cooperating with other people who might lead to something good. You never know. There's a lot of activity going on right now that is being avoided or being neglected because people just want to go about acting like it's the year 2 instead of the year 2024 or something like that. So the International Criminal Court, under the Rome Statute, would try for these cases of genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, stuff like that. And awesome, you know, there ought to be a way to hold state actors responsible for actions that they committed in another state, right? Well, or in their own state for civil war. But it requires that the country in question has submitted ratification to the statute. And if a country, say for example, wanted to invade and occupy another country illegally, well, why would they then say, oh yeah, just take our leaders to prison? And I mean, that's kind of when Bush was leaving office, there were some Europeans who were protesting that the ICC issue a warrant for his arrest. But that wouldn't have been legal, you know, even if he were decidedly a war criminal, and there's some reasonable argument to that. That wouldn't have been legal because the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and so there's like no option for a lot of people in a lot of countries. And then you can see that the green territories on this map here are, well, Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, all of South America, just about Australia, Mongolia, is that Turkmenistan, or is that Iran? I don't know which one that is. And throughout Africa, there's been claims of bias because a lot of the cases nearly all the cases on the docket at the ICC have been regarding Africa, and good on them for prosecuting war criminals. But there have been wars in Eastern Europe, in those green states. There's been other stuff that they could have brought into court, but again, burden of proof is real tough too. There are obstacles that are not just fact related, there are legal obstacles. Here's the ICJ. Compulsory jurisdiction at the ICJ is even less common than compulsory jurisdiction at the International Criminal Court. And so, like the United States withdrew from the compulsory jurisdiction during Nicaragua v. USA, in the middle of the trial, and then failed to abide by the outcome, which it was still bound to do since it didn't withdraw compulsory jurisdiction before the trial. That sets a precedent. That I know China also defied an ICJ award in the South China Sea case. So those are two. I think there's a third one. So it's not universal that countries will even follow through, which is different from a court of people. And I suppose, like in small claims court or something, you can't take blood from a stone. If somebody doesn't have money, then they can't seize assets and award damages if somebody just doesn't have any money. But that's not the case for countries. Countries always have money and assets. So it's just a matter of, I don't want to call it political stunt making or whatever, but there's more going on when it comes to countries than there is with individuals. And so there's been a lot of success with regard to trade disputes, but that's between companies, or possibly between a company and a country. There are several different forums for arbitration, especially. I want to say the World Trade Organization has one, the World Bank has one, the International Chamber of Commerce. There's a Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, and they can issue binding arbitration awards for private civil disputes, generally, which are enforceable around the world through the New York Convention. And that's fairly straightforward, because if a company is awarded damages from another company, then they can apply to a state for seizing assets in the amount of the award. Or like in the case of Walter Bao AG versus Thailand, about the tollway in Bangkok, they seized the Prince's Plane in Germany after Walter Bao applied for relief because there was a little bit of a sticky problem. They seized the Prince's Plane, but the Prince is not actually part of the government, and so there was a whole mess. But it prompted the Thai government to pay the award. Anyway, there's a way to enforce an arbitral award in a private civil commercial dispute, but when it comes to interstate actions, generally if you ask me, bad faith is the tone of the day. And so good luck trying to litigate. So it's basically just back to, again, arguments of human nature, but that doesn't really do it for me, because people have shown a lot of different capacities and tendencies. Like, for example, if people were just so universally bad and just always out to get each other and all that, then I guess maybe they would write these human rights treaties as sort of as bait or what, but I don't know, that doesn't really do it for me. There's been sufficient change in the world suggesting that, there's at least, there's a capacity to do good. I think that's pretty well established, that the worst case scenario is not guaranteed. And it's not even guaranteed that there's always going to be these huge problems. That people definitely make that happen, and their beliefs probably affect how that happens. But we've got human rights treaties, and unfortunately there's nowhere near universal ratification thereof. And part of that is because, well, this country's going to say, well, if I ratify it, then I'm going to be held to it, and this other country isn't doing it. And they could technically do the same without ratification. And if a country signs one of these things, none of them have ever been litigated at the ICJ. If a country signs one of these things, then they're basically just stating a commitment to do something. But if individuals in that country are treated some sort of way, they don't have recourse through any international system. So this is part of why the United Nations has lost a lot of credibility among certain people. But that doesn't mean that there's a substitute, or that doesn't mean that no international system is an effective substitute. I mean, but that, it begs the question, all of this kind of begs the question of what our objectives are. If there is a shared objective, if like merely waiting until the next big war is the shared objective, if encouraging the next big war is the shared objective, and I think if we listen to what a lot of people are saying, that's kind of the objective for a lot of people. That they like war, it gives them purpose, that they believe in it, that they think it's an effective means of getting what they want. But that's never how it ends, you know. It's never without human costs, other economic costs, accounting costs, property. And then it never builds the social cohesion or whatever the desired outcome. It never happens through war. It doesn't. It's short-term gains for some people, and then it just prolongs a long-term problem. And you can see that in time and again. So here there are, in fact, plenty of conflicts going on. How many are ongoing? Well, it depends who you ask. You know, what is a conflict? Does it have to be state actors? Does it have to have so many bodies that they count? And so there are a bunch of different disagreements on what even qualifies, such a conflict. But indeed, people are killing each other, and they kill each other as individuals too. You know, so this is just like an elevated scale of what happens. 22,000 murders in the United States per year, 20,000 per year, which we'll look at in a moment. Over many, many years, that's adding up to millions. That's millions of bodies. But is there a civil war in the United States? No, but some people are more or less pushing for one or predicting one without really recognizing what they're saying. Like, that's a really big problem. They're just kind of like settled into the idea that, yep, that's what's going to happen, and then something. I don't know what that something is, but it's not good. Civilians are almost always the primary casualty. Like there are only so many troops, and then I guess it depends what you call a civilian. So if one country, say for example, invades Iraq, and Iraqis take up arms to repel those invaders, that's their right, because that other country has no jurisdiction in, say, Iraq. Just for an example. But are they then civilians? Oh, I don't know. Yes, they weren't combatants before something happened that caused them to want to defend themselves. Then they organized into militias and stuff and tried to repel that attack. So I don't know. And that again depends who you ask. But I think when we think of civilians, it's always women and children. There are child soldiers and female soldiers too, but generally what I'm thinking is that anybody who wasn't enlisted in the military or a registered member of a militia group prior to said conflict emerging is a civilian. And whether by that criteria or the more normal one, civilians are huge casualties. So here's the Great Peace, so-called Long Peace, right after World War II. Wars are over. Look how many years there have been where there's more than 100,000 deaths of combatants and civilians, it says, in interstate, intrastate, and extra-systemic conflicts. Extra-systemic, that must be like proxy war? I don't know what that is. Is that like non-state actor? I don't know what that is. Extra-systemic conflicts. Interstate meaning between countries, intrastate meaning civil wars. And that's going to be, we should look up what's extra-systemic. Extra-systemic conflicts. Where are we? Here we are. What is extra-systemic conflict? Yeah, non-state group. Between a state and a non-state group. So like when somebody fights ISIS, that's extra-systemic. And sure enough, we don't want ISIS, but it's not exactly it just didn't come out of nowhere. It's just the newest thing in all this long history of things that people haven't quite figured out that, maybe this stuff's connected, I guess. Maybe. But if we're all just like waiting for the next one to happen or shell-shocked and can't focus on what's for dinner, then, good luck with that. But, so you can see what Korean War, look how many casualties there are. Korea, and then Vietnam in the 70s, not quite as many as Korea. Korea's enormous. And then the 80s, this is going to be Central American Sandinista stuff, African Civil War, Eastern Europe. The 90s, there's a lull. By lull, I mean a mere 10,000 per year mostly, and 80,000 a couple years. 98, 2000, what's that? Is that 98, 2000? That's going to be Bosnia. And then early 90s is Rwanda, or did I get them mixed up? And then into Iraq, Afghanistan. So it's a hefty pile of bodies. There's a big mountain of bodies there in the long piece. And so I guess we're just supposed to sit back and go, oh, things are great, because it's not like all war all the time, except on the news. And the same thing's going on with regard to homicide. So if we look at homicides happening domestically, that's not counted in the total body count for wars, but that's a pretty serious issue. But notice where they're happening. They're happening in Africa and in the Americas. 1.2 billion people in Africa, 162,000 homicides. 1 billion people in the Americas, 173,000 homicides. So we got disproportionate number of homicides, and I think we know a lot of that is like drug trafficker, narco gangs. But people have been reluctant to call the homicide epidemic in the United States a product of narco trafficker gangs, even though I think they could. Look at Asia, is disproportionately low homicides, 4.5 billion people, 104,000 homicides. And homicide is the one category of crime where there's almost universal reporting. Now, other crimes get reported at different rates, and homicides don't get solved very well. But they get reported because there's a dead body, and it's generally pretty obvious that it wasn't suicide or natural death, generally. Whereas the bar fight doesn't get reported. That's violent crime. It doesn't generally get reported. Theft doesn't really get reported. Theft of cars, that gets reported for insurance purposes, but the police are famously ineffective at actually solving crime. And in districts where there's higher crime, they're not going to be able to even go out and look for clues and all that. But there often aren't clues. And so they just take a report and that's it. And so why report it if nothing's going to happen? So this is one area of human activity where there's actually a lot of data. No, data isn't complete. Like I said, not all crime is reported. But it gives us a kind of a picture of what's going on. Right? And a lot of times what you'll see in the news and even in crime reporting is rates. You don't see counts. And I like to look at both of them because the rates don't really tell the whole story. So for example, let's go here. We're at the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, and they take data from all different countries, and countries have their own precincts and districts that report to the country at different varying rates, and they'll report differently, and they'll classify this crime differently in one place compared to another. And so comparing internationally is not so easy, but with murder, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Look at let's look at rates and counts. This is nice that they offer rates and counts. The FBI Uniform Crime Reporting System also does the same with rates and counts because they offer different pictures of the same problem. And here, this table is not exactly visually appealing. We'd have to sit here and look at all these numbers and then do some algebra and stuff to make meaning of it. And you can find the same in the FBI. Anybody can. That's kind of the interesting thing about what's going on presently is that people love to talk about stuff, but then they don't really know the data, but the data is all available. There's no firewall. There's no gatekeeper. It's all just out there for you. But some of it is a little bit misleading, if you ask me. Like, for example, let's look at violent crime rate and count from 1986 until 2005. Unfortunately, I didn't have anything past 2005. We'll look at homicides after 2005. But for violent crime, generally, so we got this line here is the rate, and then the bars are the totals. And you can see the left axis here is the totals, and the right axis is the rate. And you can see they kind of follow each other, like there's a little rise and then a little fall. But the totals for 1986 and 2005 are almost exactly the same, but you can see the rate has fallen by nearly 100, or roughly 100 per 100,000. So in 1985, there were approximately 1.45 million violent crimes reported, and those are only the ones reported. I don't know what the reporting rate was, and that's impossible to determine because if they didn't report it, they didn't report it. There's no record of stuff that's not reported. But let's just take it at face value. In 1986, there was approximately 1.45 million violent crimes reported. In 2005, there's approximately 1.4 million violent crimes reported. But the rate in 1986 was maybe 690 per 100,000. And the rate in 2005, about 20 years later, was about 490 per 100,000. And so the rate declines because the population increases. But when the population increases, that doesn't mean that the neighborhood is safer just because there's more people. In fact, if you ask me, it means that if there's more people, it's still the same amount of territory. So imagine living in a city, and the city doesn't grow geographically, but there's more people in it. And there's about the same amount of crime 20 years later. It's not safer just because there's more people. There's more possible combinations of how people interact, and it might, in fact, seem much less safe. That's reasonable, but it's no safer just because there's more people. That's ridiculous. But that's how the reporters report it. And rate tells us something. It tells us like a per capita income, or any rate is a statistic, but it's important to look at volumes too. Like if you invest $1,000 at 3% interest, you're not exactly living off that income, But if you invest $1 billion on 3% interest, it's still 3% interest, but it's a much different value. So let's look at 1990, approximately 23,000 and 23,500, somewhere thereabouts, murderers. And then fast forward to 2022, approximately 22,000 murders in the United States alone. In 2021, there was a sharp increase. Let's just look at the trend first. So in the 90s, we see that we have a serious decline, and that's following a quadrupling of the Dow Jones. It's following Brady Bill legislation on the gun legislation. It's also following 3 strikes laws. So there's a lot going on in the 90s. When people are wealthier, they're less likely to commit crimes. And the 90s followed the deregulation of banks in the 80s, which had pluses and minuses, and also followed NAFTA, which had pluses and minuses, but it did increase the overall wealth of the country. The Dow Jones quadrupled in the 90s. And we see that decline, but that is alongside 3 strikes laws. So people who were possibly habitual violent criminals were being put in prison for longer. And there were also some milestone gun laws in that time. So there were maybe fewer guns available for people who would have used them for bad things. there's a lot going on, so we can't really isolate one of those factors, but whatever the causes was, I guess I don't really care about the causes so much as the facts sometimes. Whatever the causes was, there was a decline, and that kind of held, I mean, the decline was quite strong in the 90s. And then starting from 2000 until about 2018, 19, it was pretty flat. I mean, it was slight decline between 06 and 14 in rate we're looking at, and also totals. But then it shot right back up. And you can see that the rate didn't increase back like in 2019, 20, 21, 22. It didn't increase at the same rate as the totals. The totals are back up to where they were in the 90s. But the rate, you can see the difference between the total bar and the rate line is quite a bit more in that range than it is in this range. It's just the columns are just barely poking up above the line in this range here. But as time goes on, because the population is growing, the columns are poking up more over the line. And so there is it's true that the rate has decreased, although in the past several years, unfortunately we don't have 2023, it's slight decline in totals from 2022. The last I read is like, it was over 20,000 homicides, but not quite back to where it was. We can find this stuff. We can absolutely find this stuff on the internet. You know, if people want to be accurate and reliable, well, they can find everything on the internet. So how many homicides in 2023? 21,000, that's Axios, that's a pretty reliable company there. Now, when the FBI reports these crime statistics, in the following report, like they'll report one for 2023, and then they'll report 2024 with adjusted numbers, and it almost always rises with the adjusted numbers. I would have to look deep into their methodology, and I'm just not that into it, and it might not even be in their section, but almost always rises. So there's probably an additional 400 murders. So we're somewhere around 21,500 murders last year. But the rate indeed would decrease, and we're seeing that the rate is not, it's just not the only thing going on. So, but when you look at, let's do a news search here for violent crime trends, and they're all down, 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 and there'll even be some in here that say, here, what the public thinks. What the public thinks, I don't know where that is. A lot of these will act like the public is just dumb for thinking that things are violent or not as good as they were. Now, it hasn't got worse, I suppose, like as far as homicides go, but it's not better. It's really not better. And so then, in some way, that is kind of worse because time has gone on and people haven't learned. So there's just like an additional psychological, social component to this, that you're still doing that this is still happening. That, you know, after these million bodies stacked up domestically, and these generally, they do change depending on a person's political perspective, and so I don't know. Maybe one side is a little bit too strongly opinionated or to think the worst, and the other side is just not paying attention. You know, it's probably a little bit of both. Or they're both overreacting, and one side is maybe overreacting one way, and the other side is overreacting a different way. But yeah, all the reports on the major news houses are just going to show you rates, because that's convenient. You know, and that's, people are familiar with, that's a manageable number, I suppose, but like, can you imagine 100,000 people? What does 100,000 people look like? And it's not like you take any old 100,000 people anywhere in the country and there's just this many murders in that 100,000 people. So if you ask me, the rate is not, it's just not a clear picture. You know, almost all the violent crime in the country takes place in a few districts or in a city. It's almost always a very narrow sliver of the city that is responsible for almost all the violent crime. And it's not evenly distributed across the country, and so there's just a lot going on with that, and people's perceptions are are skewed, in part because they're not looking at stuff themselves, and in part because those who are tasked with leading the public, which I mentioned before, are just not qualified. They're not doing a very good job with it. But indeed, people don't like complicated, and that's kind of where we are with this. This complicated stuff, and like big stuff is made of small stuff. And it's just not all just one-dimensional. So probably part of the reason that people feel more threatened in certain places as opposed to others is the way that the population has changed. So we've seen population growth across the country at a rate of what looks like, I don't know, we'll say on average 10%. And the United States naturalizes more people than any other country in the world, but that's not the only population growth. I mean, we don't even really know how many people are in the country right now. So this is just an estimate. I like that they bring it down to the ones place. 281, that's how many people there are in the country. Not really. We don't really know how many people are in the country because they're not all documented. How do you have a document showing, how much, like 30 million undocumented people, the last I checked. They're not undocumented. There's no documents. There's no record. You can't even estimate how many there are because there's no record. There's no record of something that doesn't have a record. But here's the record. Silliness. So the nationwide population growth has been lower than that in the South and West, the border states, and then traveling up the coast. And then the West has a lot of more economic advantages, and they're getting different types of immigrants too. But the border states, and then traveling up the coast, as opposed to the Northeast and Midwest, which have seen a declining increase of people in recent years. And so there's a little bit of the difference, right? But the rates, again, main idea, the rates don't adjust for increased population, which leads to, well, what does it all mean? A lot of problems, and one of the pet peeves I have is people just talk about problems and don't have any solutions. But in the case of international disputes, just like the case of personal disputes, it's not simple. And so maybe what people like to do is just turn off. But that doesn't exactly solve the problem either. And I think that's maybe the objective, is just to complain and then expect somebody else to fix it. And in some way, everybody has to fix their own way of thinking. But all of those individuals add up to the group. And since there are people going every which way and all these different combinations of what could happen, then yeah, a lot's possible. Doesn't mean it's probable. And so maybe just becoming accustomed with numbers is part of this situation. Being comfortable with scientific facts, which are not the same as like artistic and simple pictures and morally resolute religious type of thinking. These are complicated issues. I'm of the opinion that it's all related, that if we look at a map, there are those lines, but then there's people and stuff moving all across the place too, and all of it fits together like a puzzle, and you take one piece out and it's not complete. And so in my opinion, the individuals make up the group, and the group is made of individuals. And maybe there's a little something different, like when a group gets together, because there are different parts of different individuals group in different ways at smaller levels, but you can't have a big picture without a bunch of small pictures. And what we're seeing at the individual level is people aren't happy, healthy, and well-adjusted. And they're angry about that too. They're angry about being angry. Can you believe that? Or they're happy about being angry. Or maybe they're happy about being angry. I really think people like being angry. But either way, they're not happy, healthy, and well-adjusted to the world that we live in presently. And maybe that's always been that way. I don't know. I wasn't always alive. I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, we read stuff, and then, as we know, there's stuff that wasn't documented, and people lie. So I'm making my own guesses. But happy, healthy, well-adjusted people don't kill each other and advocate or support killing. That's just not, that doesn't fit. So all of the excuse making and justifying and rationalizing one way or another isn't really setting a trend toward anything any different, let alone better. And if one group of people decides that they can get away with murder, then so is another group of people going to decide that they can get away with murder. And they're just locking horns after that. It's a northbound, southbound zag stuck in their tracks, and neither will move, and it's not going to be a pretty ending. You know, that's a recipe for disaster. And that's kind of how we've come to be stubbornly engaged in civil, political, and domestic conflicts. You know, just like, you know, at least if you're in a marriage, I guess you can break up, you know, but just like in an individual relationship or a familiar relationship, people who are bent on being stubborn and at odds with each other aren't going to have happy outcomes. And if they treat each other like idiots, they're not going to have happy outcomes. And if they think the other is evil because they have a slightly different viewpoint, then that's just not going to be a happy outcome. And it's perfectly acceptable if people just want to associate with others that are exactly like them or very much like them. That's their right, can't stop them, and it's better that they just do that than try to make the rest of us miserable. At scale, there are just different people who believe different things, who live different ways, and that's how it's going to be. There's never been a successful attempt to change all the other people, and I'm just going to have to say there's not going to be. Now, it's not impossible, but it's very, very improbable. Like less probable than a happy outcome where we all just kind of deal with it. So, yeah, there's the lack of consensus. There's competing groups who have competing interests, who have their own selfish intent, who want all the big pieces of the pie for themselves, and people who look exactly like them. There's pseudo-collectivism. You know, a bunch of people who look and sound almost exactly alike, act like they're individuals, but really their individuality is just tied up into this group identity. So, and there's relative consensus within those groups, but then if you zoom out and there's a bigger picture, there's just more people. Just go a little bit further away, there's more people and other people who have their own ideas. And so then bridging the gap becomes a big challenge, which, you know, if one just stays home and acts like the world doesn't exist, I guess for that individual that is a reasonable approach, you know, if they just can't bear it. But they're, sure enough, still dependent on stuff that comes from other places, and stuff includes ideas. You know? And so if we want to exist in this world, it's highly advisable to figure out that there's just different ways. And so political will and consensus doesn't have to be that we all agree with each other and that we sing kumbaya and all this stuff, but that we would have some shared principles and some shared objectives, just like back in 1945 when they founded the United Nations. You know, people came together and they could not have written that document intending that states would fall apart and people would mob up and blow each other up to no end, and that, you know, this 40, 80, 100 years later, this exact same thing more or less would be happening, and that there's, you know, all this talk about civil wars and World War III, and that basically people are just going about their business, talking about the craziest thing ever, acting like, well, I guess, you know, something that doesn't deserve the way. It's a waste of time, you know, to not make a moral judgment about that. You know, people act like it's unavoidable, basically, like it's like they don't play any part in it, you know, and so but sure enough, you know, as individuals get together and form groups, their political will is felt and exerted on others who likewise enact political will, and when they're at odds, then, you know, they can just go mob up like that Twist and Speed Not Mobster song and just get more and more people mob up, but that doesn't exactly solve the underlying dispute. You know, that's a recipe for hostilities. Or very inefficient communications and very inefficient relationships. And that's very much not something that we can generally afford nowadays, since we're really well integrated, you know, with the supply chains and economies, and, you know, this economy goes down and then a civil war starts, and these previously discrete areas of human behavior are now more than ever kind of obviously connected. So an emerging consensus on something else, an emerging political will on something else is probably a good idea. But, there's traditions and there's no enforcement mechanism, sure enough. There's no forum internationally. Just like, more than half of murders are, chances are you'll get away with murder. It doesn't exactly make for an environment that fosters and encourages proper behavior, which is where you get individuals. The individual who's the leader is also a follower of his or her people, and they have to make decisions based on something other than getting elected, or something other than getting more money, or something other than their own megalomaniacal narcissism. They have to, people have, and there's always that option for those who make the decisions to pay attention to some other smaller group or some other type of vocal group in the country, but whatever decisions they make, chances are they're going to get away with it scot-free. So that's a problem, and maybe in 500 years there could be something, but until then it's going to take a lot of personal effort, and discernment, because nations can't be held accountable, really. It's too big a group. Coincidentally, Germany and Japan are two very well-off countries, and they were the bad guys in World War II. In fact, I've thought that Japan might have actually won World War II. Like when they finally surrendered, they say that they only lost the battle and not the war. I'm kind of thinking that, a long time from now, people might look back on that a little bit differently and look, well, their lifespan is the longest. They're wealthier than just about anybody. They have like 2 murders a year. I think they're doing okay. If I had to choose, which one looks like a good role model? It's not the one, carrying guns, throwing ass and titties everywhere, and snorting whatever you can find on the television, while also balking about moral rectitude and all that. No, it's definitely not that. But anyway, that's a different issue. Well, it's kind of not a different issue, but when it comes to holding states accountable, only a few people are going to be held accountable. So the rest of them are going to go about their business and do what they want. Like Vladimir Putin is not the only person involved in the invasion of Ukraine, but if the ICC were to arrest somebody, it would be him, but he's not even in Ukraine. He hasn't fired a weapon. It's other people. And so the people who actually go out and do the deeds are most certainly making the problem, even though they're paid to do a job or whatever. They have choices. When it comes down to it, those leaders know that. People know that this is a group, it's a collective action problem. It's a group thing. And people are doing it at home too. They're doing it in the street. They're doing it in the road. There's, I once did let's sum up the number of minutes. Let's do this here. We're going to sum up the number of minutes in a year. If we got 21,000, let's say 22,000 murders per year, and we'll divide that by 365. So that's 60.27 per day. And let's divide that by 24. That's 2.5 per hour, and then so 2.5 per hour is what, every 25 minutes, divide by, let's divide 60 by 2.5. Oops, no, that wasn't it. 60 divided by 2.5. 24 minutes. Every 24 minutes there's a murder somewhere in the wealthiest, or, whatever. It was the greatest country in the world. So we got a collective action problem. Basically, there's incentives not to change, and there's disincentives to change. And if everybody made the change, then there'd be good things. But if a few people try to make some sort of change, then they're penalized when everybody would get the benefit if the whole group changed. But because of a combination of factors, from people being stupid and lazy, which is human nature, I guess, to poor leadership, to really angry, violent, people like to do bad things, to cowardice, to job exclusion and social exclusion for being a good person, basically, then the group keeps on doing this bad thing, which it should change. And I think everybody in the group more or less knows that it should change, but again, because of this weird situation called the collective action problem, then it doesn't. So there is little hope, but there is some. It's not zero. And being that these are the important things, like as far as quality of life goes, having a life is probably going to increase the quality of life. Like if one's life is taken, then one cannot experience higher quality of life. And we could legislate it. That's really annoying saw drill in the background. We could legislate it, but people can't really be trusted to abide by the laws. If a country can't abide by its own law, and if people are famous for doing the wrong thing on purpose. However, that doesn't mean that there are zero possibilities. And countries misinterpret treaties just the same as lawyers misinterpret domestic law, and loopholeism kind of takes over. What's a loophole? It's just bad faith interpretation. That's not legitimate interpretation. And unfortunately, in English, we've allowed ourselves this thing where words just mean what everybody says, what somebody conjures up, and everybody just has to go, oh yeah, that's a really smart idea, rather than denying it somewhere. Just deny it on sight. It's really obvious. But in English and in the heterogeneous culture of English speakers, apparently that's not yet an option. So they could, these are not going to happen because congressional leaders are, heavily invested in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics and such. But they could take them off the stock market, so as to decrease the profit of, the profit motive for creating conflict around the world. I mean, coincidentally, just after World War II, the GM CEO called for a permanent war economy, which is more or less what we have. One of the few successful stocks during the early Afghan-Iraq wars was just that group of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and so on. And corporations hire private militias. They do bad things. There are nefarious activities that happen outside of corporate offices, especially in foreign territories. Who knows what's going on to protect Nigerian oil wells? There are private militias and mercenary groups all around the world that billionaires hire. And so the idea that they kind of set up dominoes to fall is not exactly out of the question. Charlie Wilson was over there in 1982 or whatever, given Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen rocket-propelled grenades to fight off the Soviets, and then coincidentally he comes back on them, 20-some years later. And that's a congressman, So there's a lot going on, but getting the weapons manufacturers off the stock market wouldn't be a bad idea. I don't think it's going to happen, but it seems like that should be a joint public-private effort where those companies shouldn't be allowed to sell to everybody they can find either. War Powers Act isn't constitutional if you ask a lot of people. The power to declare war is vested in the Congress as per the Constitution. So they could revisit the War Powers Act and then, thereby address executive overreach, because there hasn't been a war since World War II, right? But never mind that the United States has caused more casualties than the Holocaust since then. There hasn't been a war declared. But never mind that $20 trillion that got spent, and hopefully that just sits on a pad. Hopefully those weapons never get used, But while everybody's a fiscal conservative nowadays, talking about, the budget, the bill, the bid, it's gone and it's gone and counted for, but the Pentagon hasn't been audited ever. It's supposed to be audited every year. And why does it spend so much money? Because the executive can just do whatever it wants. Well, again, that's probably not going to happen. Because what? Domestic courts are corrupt, and they rely on the political question doctrine. Congress people are corrupt, and basically it's a payday. When they get out of office, they can go directly to whatever they want and make a big payday. That's a big part of it. And because people want blood. There's another one. The population perceives foreign and domestic lives differently. If one of our guys gets blown up in another country, somehow the terrorists did that, even though if some other country came to our country, then that same person would be a hero, blowing up that person in the other country. So there's some sort of weird caveman stuff going on with the life of this person is worth more or less than the life of that person. And people don't even recognize it just that simply. It's really twisted. But until that ends, there's, even domestically, self above all, and then this person's life is worth more or less than that person. This rating of the value of life is a little bit silly, and it's telling, it really is. And it just shows the hypocrisy and the latent narcissism and just disorder. It's disorder. The government spending on militarization versus public health and welfare is also another telling sign that there's try to decrease the Pentagon budget in the United States, even though it's a runaway bill. It's political suicide. And it's the people they demand it, and that is their socialism, that these are jobs for people who have no skills. The military recruits people who cannot get a job anywhere, and they do very well. And the military recruits other people too, but it's a paycheck. And for the weapons manufacturers, again, let's hope we don't ever use those weapons, and those boats, and those bombs, and those tanks. Let's hope this just never ever happens, but it's a jobs program. Whereas and then coincidentally, the public health is on the decline, shall we say. It's never been worse. It's never been worse. And there's murders, and the cities look awful. It all just looks terrible. So I was watching, I don't know, was it Jon Stewart or somebody had this Muslim and this Jew on the program, and they both have fairly different ideas, but they're friendly. And at one point, the Muslim said that he grew up in Pakistan, and his dad used to complain about how the Americans were doing something overseas, and then he came to visit the son in New York City and saw the subway, and the dad said, I get it now, they can't do it, I get it, okay, they can't, they just don't know how to have nice things, because trains in other places don't look like ours, and cities in other places don't look like ours. There are some ugly cities, but they don't look like ours. And that's the people, so I'm sure the government could have at least motivated people somehow. There could have been a little bit something, but then in a government formed by the people, then if that's what the people want, then that's apparently what they get. You want canonization, glorification, mysticization, romanticization of war, soldiers, so much that there's murder in the music. You can murder somebody in your song you just can't get enough murder? You gotta murder them in your song. Oh, there's a drum behind it, it's art, right? You can put a drum behind anything. It doesn't make it art, it doesn't make it poetry. And then ultimately, whether at home or abroad, whether individuals or collectives, it's just a moral failing. People gotta figure out what a moral is, have some sort of common shared ideas of what is moral and immoral. And I think one of the things that all around the world, nobody really thinks killing is moral, but except in that one case where they justify it because it's somehow more, I don't know how they do it. But in the end, robbing, raping, and killing, that's the immoral stuff. And if you find yourself making excuses for somebody's robbing, raping, and killing, then don't be surprised when somebody else says, well, you can't do that. He has his reasons. or something otherwise stupid sounding. I guess that's the T. Reading room's not closed.